Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the third in a series of 4 mini lectures on the Philadelphia story. Today we're going to talk about the Daughters' Rebellion. In the first mini lecture, I compared the Philadelphia story to Native Son and to the historical context these very different works share. I suggested that they're linked on a deep level by a cultural fantasy I call the Ancient Nightmare. I argued that this fantasy connects both works to the main theme of the course and to the other readings. It makes this connection not by way of the chosen son narrative, but rather as a story about daughters. Those are the two main story types we've seen in the works on our syllabus this semester. Stories about the great expectations and the dangerous sacrifices that await the chosen son, and stories about the perils of exchanging the daughter in marriage. Last time, I promised to describe the pattern of the action, explaining in more detail how I interpret the film. That's what I'll do today. There are different ways to analyze the pattern of the action in any of the works we've read. The outlines I've been providing probably come pretty close to the kinds of plans and sketches the authors actually used in composing the works, but of course they also reflect the way I'm interpreting these stories. I mention this because I really expected to see a different pattern in the Philadelphia story than the one I actually came up with. The movie, as I said, is based on a Broadway play, and so I thought it would break down clearly into the two-act structure typical of Broadway comedies. Instead, what I see is a pattern in 4 movements. The action is framed for us twice. First, by the opening credits and the closing cast list, but then again within that frame by the opening pantomime scene, only music you remember, no dialogue, matched by the closing scene of wedding photos.
I did it. I did it all.
I feel as though I lived through all this before in another life.
This sequence pulls us out of the wedding scene, literally framing it in the snapshot taken by Sidney Kidd. It harks back to the opening pantomime as well by replaying the same 2 musical themes associated with the main characters. This is interesting because it was Sidney Kidd who wanted to tell Tracy's story, his way. You might wonder whether Tracy, like Pip, or even to a limited extent Bigger, gets to be the narrator of her own story. The answer is no. To understand why, we have to think about the difference between reading a book and watching a movie. What is the equivalent in this film to the covenant, the narrative contract, that we've seen in previous works? Since this is a film, it should be a cinematic contract, but where do we find it? Sidney Kidd's blackmail. The movie camera and its audience are allowed into the Lord household along with Mike and Liz because Sidney Kidd is threatening to run an expose of Seth Lord's flirtation with a New York dancer, Tina Mara. When Mike learns this from Dexter late in the film, he says, "We all rode into this thing on a filthy blackmail." If you think about it, that "we" includes us as viewers and the camera we look through, along with Mike and Liz and the 35mm camera she brings with her. For Tracy, this means that she can't control the way her story gets told. She has to make a deal, a covenant, with Dexter, and through him with Spy magazine, to let her story be told in a way and in a venue she despises. Of course, the film itself isn't quite the same as the magazine. It tells a much richer version of Tracy's story. But it does have something in common with the magazine, and that's why the film takes its title straight out of Sidney Kidd's mouth.
Your assignment for this spy's most sensational achievement. Tracy Lord, Big game hunting in Africa, fox hunting in Pennsylvania. Married on impulse and divorced in a rage. And always unapproachable by the press. The unapproachable Miss Lord. The Philadelphia Story.
What the film has in common with Spy Magazine is our own desire for gossip about the lifestyles of the rich and famous. I said that this movie is partly a class romance, wooing its Depression-era audience to patch up its differences with the American upper class, and so it sails into the Lord Mansion on the same tide of popular curiosity that the magazine appeals to. The film recognizes this and smartly makes fun of itself by seizing upon Sidney Kidd as its comic villain. So much for the frame and the narrative contract. Inside this frame, the action unfolds in 4 movements, corresponding to the morning, afternoon, and evening of a single day, concluding with the morning after. The first morning movement carries us into the mansion itself. It establishes Tracy's character and her family's predicament and introduces us to George Kittredge. Then it takes us to the offices of Spy Magazine, and from there launches the infiltration of the Lord Mansion by spies. Although they aren't crazy about their assignment, Mike and Liz clearly represent the movie-going, magazine-buying public in the mixture of envy, resentment, curiosity, and desire that comes across in their attitudes toward the wealthy. Meanwhile, Dexter's small blackmail seals the cinematic contract. Then Tracy, true to her strong-willed and intelligent character, turns the tables on Mike and Liz with a performance that starts out as an over-the-top parody of popular stereotypes about the rich and winds up with her interviewing the reporters, making them feel what it's like to be put on the spot. This first movement ends as Seth returns home and the family all gather for lunch. The afternoon movement begins in the library. Here we see the first major change of direction as Tracy and Mike begin to take an obvious interest in one another. These scenes prepare for the romance that develops between them later that night, but they also serve to initiate a sequence that will follow Tracy through crucial encounters with each of her 4 love interests: Mike, Dexter, George, and her father. First, Mike rejects her offer to let him use her hunting cottage as a writing retreat. Art can't perform the function of social criticism effectively if it depends on patronage, so here we see the politics of the 30s showing through. This is followed by the scene in which Dexter reveals so much about Tracy and their marriage that Mike, embarrassed, slips away. This is where the film begins to take its sexual politics seriously. No more jokes about pipes and golf clubs or about the groom being still at the gatehouse.
Sure, don't bother to open your house. Stay here. We're having no house guests over the wedding.
No?
No.
How about the groom?
He's still at the gatehouse.
Oh, that's good.
Now, instead of jokes, we get speeches about what's wrong with American women in the 20th century. It was actually Mike who got started on this theme back in the South Parlor. "The young, rich, rapacious American female," he declares as if describing a breed of animal. "No other country where she exists." Out by the swimming pool, Dexter makes a similarly sweeping generalization. "There are more of you than people realize," he tells Tracy, "a special class of the American female, the married maidens." This talk about married virginity looks to me like a coded way of describing Tracy as sexually frigid. Of course, the film also has ways of telling us that she isn't naturally frigid at all. There's her first encounter with George, for example, in which we see the so-called goddess getting down and dirty.
Hello, darling.
Hello.
Well, how do you like me?
I adore you, but you look awful.
Awful.
You look like something right out of a shop window.
Oh, Tracy,
Oh,
What? Hey, what? Ouch! Say, listen, get it out. They're new.
That's just it. They're new, but they're not going to be. There, that's better.
So perhaps frigidity isn't really the problem. Take another look here. Who's on top? If that's what Dexter means by calling Tracy a goddess, then perhaps all this coded language is, in fact, confusing frigidity with sexual dominance. When Dexter describes her as a married maiden, Tracy certainly looks horrified. And not just horrified, but hurt. The accusation of frigidity is one she takes deeply to heart. Enter George, now, who makes the mistake of telling Tracy that he worships her. He's putting her right back up on the pedestal. Clearly, that's not what she wants to hear. She doesn't respond well in this scene. We saw earlier that while she may want to knock George down and climb on top of him, she isn't the least bit hesitant about getting dirty. The sexual significance of all this imagery is reinforced by Tracy's lines about the sailboat and how yar she was, she being the boat and not the bride. The final scene in this series shows us Seth Lord lecturing Tracy while he mixes martinis. He patiently explains to her that nothing happened with Tina Mara. Here again we see that the presumption has been more important than the fact, and that this nothing which happened is all Tracy's fault anyway. He accuses her of acting like a jealous wife and mentions her ego, both signs that Papa has read his Freud, or at least heard about it. The message is Freudian, too. Tracy needs to overcome her sexual repression. But the message is also deeply patriarchal. A properly sexualized daughter is one who gives her father absolute, uncritical love. According to this logic, Tracy may have been acting like a jealous wife, but her father has been acting like a rejected suitor. Tina Mara isn't a sexual substitute for his wife, she's a romantic substitute for his daughter. This series of encounters with her love interests shows us what's really at stake in Tracy's humiliation. She's acting as the head of the family, giving orders, wearing trousers, and climbing on top of her fiancé. It's Mike, in the library, who gets a glimpse of the vulnerable girl hiding behind the tough exterior. Dexter, by the pool, doesn't persuade Tracy to ease off her high horse by showing his vulnerable side. He turns aggressive and deliberately hurts her. By the time the scenes with George and Seth have unfolded, Tracy's independence is thoroughly compromised. She's seeing herself through the eyes of the male characters, and they keep telling her that she's sexually unresponsive because she's too proud and unforgiving. I'd like to suggest that none of this is quite true. What if, for proud, we try substituting unwilling to be submissive? For unforgiving, let's try unwilling to accept male infidelity. For frigid, suppose we try sexually dominant. Now, I don't know if you'll find this alternative sketch of Tracy convincing, but just entertain it for a moment. To the extent that there's any truth in it, we're beginning to tell a very different story. Not that of a proud, sexually repressed woman who has to learn about human fallibility through personal experience, and who has to accept her femininity in order to find happiness in marriage. Instead, it begins to look like the story of an independent, sexually aggressive woman who can't respond in a submissive role, who resents the greater sexual freedom men enjoy, and who can be forced into the traditional mold of submissive femininity only through the humiliating experience of being forced to see herself through the eyes of the men around her. She has to internalize a masculine view of herself. That's why I said earlier that Tracy never gets to tell her own story. In my view, the film is about how Tracy learns to accept the story men tell about her. Tracy Lord doesn't vindicate herself. She doesn't insist on telling her own story. Instead, she learns to be Yar, and no doubt lives happily ever after. Next time, we'll see how all this plays out in the third movement that evening, and in the fourth movement the next morning.